A man kills an elderly millionaire by throwing him off a bridge, but a small child, hiding, saw everything and secretly saved him. What he did next. Mr. Andrew had built his fortune through sheer effort and determination. Born in a humble neighborhood, he forged his path in the textile business until he became one of the country's leading magnates. Known for his large donations and social work, he ran scholarship programs for underprivileged students and sponsored foundations that promoted education in remote regions. On the streets, people spoke his name with respect and admiration, and the newspapers held him up as a prime example of modern philanthropy. However, within the privacy of his home and in his dealings with those closest to him, there was a silent distance that few truly understood. Despite his recognized public virtues, Mr. Andrew did not show the same warmth toward his own family. His relatives, among them his niece Laura, his brother Rick, and his nephew Josh, didn't feel the warm closeness many would have imagined. There was something in the way he managed personal matters that made him gruff and rigid when faced with the daily problems of those around him. In fact, he was more likely to show up at major charity events than at a family anniversary or a simple meeting to discuss minor issues. Over the years, his loved ones had learned not to expect more from him than formal gestures or financial support, without ever finding genuine companionship or words of encouragement. Josh, the ambitious nephew, was the one who most persistently sought Mr. Andrew's attention and support. From a very young age, he had been interested in the textile industry, convinced that his uncle could open every door for him to rise within the family business. However, Mr. Andrew, always cautious with power and fearful that someone might exploit his good reputation, remained reluctant to relinquish any responsibilities. Josh resented this attitude. He considered himself capable of leading the company, and whenever Mr. Andrew appeared on television receiving awards for his social work, Josh muttered under his breath that his uncle devoted more time to his philanthropic facade than to preparing the family's true legacy. The feeling of being permanently in the shadows consumed him, making him grow more frustrated each day. Meanwhile, Laura, Mr. Andrew's daughter, lived with a constant sense of resentment toward her father. Ever since she was a child, she remembered his long absences. He was always away on business trips or at ceremonies to accept honors. True, she had grown accustomed to a life of comfort, but it was empty of the paternal presence she so badly needed. Whenever she tried to address the lack of a more genuine bond, she was met with the severe gaze of the old man, who dismissed the topic with a haughty statement. "I have worked my entire life to give you the best. You have no right to complain." Laura could find no response to that stance, yet she felt that behind those cold eyes stood a wall as tall as the one he himself had raised between his family and his world. This reality pushed her to pour herself into her own projects without seeking her father's opinion. However, deep down, she still hoped that one day he would acknowledge her worth as a person and not just as part of his decorative entourage. Rick, Mr. Andrew's younger brother, had decided to leave the business many years earlier. A calm-natured man, he never got involved in conflicts and preferred to devote himself to teaching history at a private school. Thanks to his magnate brother's financial support, he had achieved a comfortable living, yet he kept out of the family intrigues. However, his passivity sometimes made Laura and Josh uncomfortable, since they expected Rick to take a firmer stance, both in the company and when it came to tough decisions. Though Rick was aware of the underlying tension, he generally slipped away whenever arguments arose, hiding behind diplomatic statements like, "We'll talk about this another day," or "Let's not stir up trouble." That morning, the family dynamic repeated itself yet again. Mr. Andrew had called a meeting in the main hall of his lavish residence. Word of his upcoming donation to a children's rehabilitation center had fueled expectations in the press, and he wanted to make sure the family was aware as well. Laura arrived without any intention of celebrating, while Josh waited restlessly, trying to coax from his uncle some hint about the company's future. Rick, meanwhile, sat off to one side reading a newspaper, keeping himself occupied as everyone settled in. The room's walls were adorned with portraits of Mr. Andrew receiving international awards, embracing children in rural regions, or inaugurating homes for the elderly. His philanthropic mark clearly extended beyond national borders. But just when he was explaining the details of his new project, Josh interjected in a slightly caustic tone. He wanted to know if, besides making those donations, his uncle planned to delegate more executive duties. One sharp look from Mr. Andrew was enough to halt any immediate comeback. Laura, quietly, fixed her gaze on the floor, holding back the urge to accuse her father of putting on a media show while neglecting his family. Rick, for his part, cleared his throat nervously, unwilling to step into the conversation. The atmosphere grew tense. Mr. Andrew continued talking about his corporate and social legacy as though he hadn't noticed the discomfort in the air. Nonetheless, the rift between the two sides of his life, public and private, was widening, as if waiting for someone to acknowledge the affection he seemed incapable of offering. In a way, everyone sensed that this meeting marked the beginning of something monumental. None of them could say for sure what it was, but the tight silence served as the prelude to a family conflict that threatened to shake the foundations of that textile empire, praised by so many around the globe. John was only 10 years old, but his family's precarious situation forced him to grow up faster than usual. He lived with his mother, Rosa, and his little sister, Luli, in a humble neighborhood of tin shacks, lined with dusty roads and crumbling walls. It was a place where children ran barefoot after a worn-out soccer ball and where adults often gathered on corners to talk about daily struggles. Despite its shortcomings, a certain warmth existed among neighbors. They shared the little they had and helped each other through the worst moments. Still, John felt that life had gotten even harder lately, especially since his mother had become ill and could barely get out of bed to manage household chores. Rosa's illness had no clear diagnosis. It began with fevers that would come and go, persistent headaches, and a fatigue so intense she couldn't work. Previously, she had earned a living as a seamstress for some local workshops or by mending neighbors' clothes for a bit of money. But in recent months, that source of income practically vanished, leaving the family dependent on the few savings Rosa kept in a coffee can. Those savings ran out quickly, particularly after Rosa, in a moment of desperation, turned to Nicholas, a loan shark who prowled the neighborhood promising to solve financial problems. She knew turning to someone like that was risky, as the interest and threats could reach inhuman extremes, but she convinced herself that she had no other choice if she wanted to keep affording her medication and maintain a roof over their heads. That decision soon became a nightmare. Nicholas started demanding weekly payments with ever higher surcharges, and Rosa trembled every time she saw his battered car approaching her door. John, fully aware of the situation, overheard his mother's conversations with the loan shark through the cardboard walls of their modest home. Even though he was only 10, he grasped the gravity of what was happening and grew anxious thinking about what would occur if his mother couldn't gather the money. Nicholas often showed up with two grim-faced toughs who threatened to seize their few belongings, or worse, throw them out on the street. That ever-present sense of danger made John feel responsible for finding solutions, even if he was just a child. That was how he began venturing to the riverbanks at night, beyond the authorized fishing area. It was illegal, but he steeled himself to try to catch a few fish he could then sell at the local market. He knew that getting caught could land him in trouble with the authorities, but the need was stronger than his fear. Armed with a makeshift rod and a bucket, he slipped out once the sun had set, and the neighborhood lights gave way to darkness. To Luli, who was only 6, he always said he was going out to find firewood or something to eat, to keep her from worrying. Although she was very young, she sensed her brother was doing something risky, yet she trusted him wholeheartedly. Each time John returned with a couple of fish, Rosa looked at him with sad, worried eyes. She didn't want her son putting himself in danger, but she also had no way to stop it. She was weak, and without a steady income, paying Nicholas was next to impossible. As for John, far from showing fear, he displayed a determination that surprised everyone. He knew the deserted parts of the river and had learned to crouch among the bushes to avoid being spotted by the forest rangers. On those cold nights, he often repeated to himself that he had no right to complain. "I have to do this. Otherwise, my mom will just get worse," he thought, while his breath mingled with the fog rising over the water. Seeing John, barely weighing 60 pounds, battling the current and the wind, was a heartbreaking portrait of a childhood stolen by poverty. Yet it also revealed his courage, his innocence, and an unbreakable loyalty to his family. With the fish he managed to catch and sell, he earned a few coins to cover at least part of the debt to Nicholas. Sometimes, if luck was on his side, he came back home with enough to buy a basic medical kit or some groceries for Luli and Rosa. Other times, he returned empty-handed, with nothing to give his mother but a hug and a few words of comfort. Through it all, hope still burned in the heart of that 10-year-old boy. As he listened to his mother's shallow breathing at night, he promised himself that somehow he would find a way to help her pull through. He felt that the love he had for her and for Luli was stronger than the fear of getting caught fishing illegally or being pursued by the loan shark. That combination of innocence and determination drove him to keep trying day after day, night after night. The neighborhood, with its flickering lights and dusty streets, quietly witnessed John's courage. A boy who, armed only with a hook and an old bucket, was fighting a daily battle for his family's well-being. For now, he had no idea that his path was about to intersect with someone so different from himself, a powerful textile magnate who, despite being applauded by the world, also carried his own family shadows. Josh never tired of looking at the portraits of Mr. Andrew hanging on the walls of the textile company's main building. In black and white photographs, the old man appeared receiving honors for his philanthropic work or signing contracts with top executives. In many people's eyes, that gallery stood as evidence of a visionary and highly successful man. However, Josh merely saw in them a reflection of his own stagnation. He felt that time was passing him by and that despite his ambition, he remained a mere pawn within an empire that his uncle refused to relinquish. From early on, Josh had dreamed of inheriting the company. His father died when Josh was still a teenager, leaving him under the moral tutelage of Mr. Andrew, who, with a mix of coldness and paternalism, gave him opportunities to study abroad. Josh took full advantage of those years, specializing in administration and finance, fully expecting that once he graduated, he would earn a prominent role in the business. However, upon returning, he found a more cautious and distrustful Mr. Andrew than ever, clinging to every managerial decision and unwilling to step aside. The promise that someday Josh would inherit the leadership role repeated itself endlessly, yet never came to pass. As time went on, Josh sank into his own frustration. He saw his uncle lead meetings, negotiate with suppliers, and accept accolades for his philanthropy, while Josh was pushed into secondary roles. To make matters worse, whenever he tried to propose new marketing strategies or expand into innovative lines of business, Mr. Andrew would pat him on the back and remind him that prudence was the key to success. From Josh's perspective, that prudence was nothing but mistrust disguised as wisdom. The final straw came when he discovered that Mr. Andrew planned to launch an educational project using part of the company's profits, without even consulting him. That day, Josh felt as though his uncle was mocking him, ignoring any chance of giving him a major voice in decision-making. In addition to the pressure he felt in the family arena, Josh found himself facing a new, silent threat. In a desperate attempt to secure more influence within the company, he had taken out a loan from a shady investor named Martin Baeza. This man, known for his dubious reputation, financed struggling business people with promises of large returns in a short time. Josh used the money to buy shares in the textile company itself, convinced he could position himself as one of the main shareholders and thereby force Mr. Andrew to surrender part of his control. However, the share prices failed to rise as quickly as he had hoped, and the loan's interest rate had skyrocketed alarmingly. As the weeks passed, Martin Baeza's calls became increasingly urgent. At first, the investor tried to stay friendly, reminding Josh of his payment deadlines, but over time, those reminders morphed into veiled threats. One afternoon, Josh found an envelope on the seat of his car containing a single sheet of paper. "Pay what you owe, or we'll start collecting in other ways." That message alone was enough to make Josh's heart pound. He felt a knot in his stomach and, for the first time, realized he was on the edge of a cliff. If he didn't find the money soon, his professional life and perhaps even his personal safety would be in jeopardy. John arrived at Mr. George's cabin out of breath, deep in a dense woodland that few dared visit. It was a secluded spot, reached by a dirt path riddled with potholes and flanked by thick bushes that made it difficult to see from afar. At 10 years old, the boy had never ventured so far from home, let alone into such a lonely place. Still, the urgency of saving the injured old man he had found on the riverbank drove him to push past his exhaustion and nerves. He pounded on the door, heart racing so fast it felt on the verge of bursting. When the door opened, a tall man stood before him, brow furrowed and gaze steady, his grey hair hinting at an unyielding discipline. He wore simple clothing, yet his rigid posture revealed a military past. John swallowed hard before speaking, while Mr. George eyed him with both curiosity and caution. The child, soaked and trembling, blurted out in hurried words, "Please, I need help. There's a man hurt down by the river. He fell from the bridge. He's in bad shape." For an instant, the ex-soldier's stern expression softened. Something in the boy's urgent plea reminded him of the responsibility he had felt long ago when rescuing fellow comrades in danger. Without a second thought, Mr. George stepped outside, grabbed a makeshift first aid kit, and set off after the child toward the spot where the old man lay. Their run to the riverbank was intense. John dashed as fast as he could, while Eusebio, clutching the kit, kept a firm stride. They found Mr. Andrew exactly where the boy had left him, unconscious, soaked, and with streaks of dried blood on his forehead. Eusebio knelt beside him, checked his pulse, and confirmed he was still alive, though his breathing was shallow. Immediately, he inspected the head wound, touching it gently, worried there might be major trauma. "We need a doctor," Eusebio muttered, frowning at the severity of the injuries. "If we move him carelessly, we could make it worse." "I know someone," John exclaimed, thinking of Dr. Johnson, a physician his mother Rosa admired for treating patients at minimal cost. She lived quite a distance away, but it was their closest option if they wanted to avoid raising suspicion. That night, under a sky choked with dark clouds, Mr. George and John improvised a stretcher out of branches and a blanket. With great effort, they carried Mr. Andrew to the cabin, stopping every few yards to adjust their grip. Although Eusebio was strong, he clearly felt the strain of moving an unresponsive body, while John gritted his teeth, refusing to be defeated by his aching arms. After what seemed like an eternity, they finally got inside the cabin and laid Mr. Andrew on a cot that Eusebio normally kept for emergencies. While Eusebio carefully cleaned the wound on the old man's forehead and checked for other injuries, John dashed off to contact Dr. Johnson. He soon found a neighbor who, without asking questions, let him use a phone to call the doctor. After a few tense minutes, Dr. Johnson agreed to come right away, urging the boy to keep everything secret. She did not want trouble with the local authorities or the loan sharks who lurked around the area. Shortly after midnight, Dr. Johnson arrived at the cabin. She moved discreetly, driving an old car whose engine barely made a sound. Upon entering, she examined Mr. Andrew with the practiced eye of a professional and confirmed that he had suffered a severe head injury, plus hypothermia and signs of shock. She meticulously cleaned and stitched the wound, administered basic medications to prevent infection, and monitored his breathing, placing him in a position to allow better airflow. Though her face remained calm, her eyes betrayed deep concern. "We can stabilize him here, but he'll need rest and constant care," the doctor remarked after spending several hours tending to her patient. "He should really be in a hospital, but I know the police might have a lot of questions." John looked up uneasily. He couldn't forget the image of the man who had pushed Mr. Andrew off the bridge. He was terrified that if they found out he was still alive, they would finish the job. He shared his fears with the doctor and Eusebio, explaining in a child's simple language what he had witnessed. Both the ex-soldier and the doctor exchanged looks, aware of the danger. If someone was capable of attempting murder so callously, anyone who helped Mr. Andrew might be at risk. The decision was almost unanimous. Eusebio offered his cabin as a refuge, a remote, seldom visited place protected from city noise. With the doctor's help, they would prepare the space to keep Mr. Andrew stable until he recovered enough to explain what had happened and, if necessary, press charges. The ex-soldier vowed to keep an eye on the grounds, ready to protect the old man from any intruder. Meanwhile, the doctor promised regular visits and any needed medication, so long as everyone kept absolute silence. In that moment, a quiet pact formed among them. They would hide the old man and protect him from further attacks. They knew little of who he was, but John's account and the signs of violence suggested someone had tried to end his life. As for John, he left the cabin feeling a sense of relief that, at least for that night, Mr. Andrew was in safe hands with Eusebio and Dr. Johnson. He headed home with weary feet, thinking of his sick mother and of Luli, but also feeling he had saved a man who otherwise would have died alone. Neither he nor the others suspected that this act of rescue would bind their fates forever. Josh arrived in town at dusk, driving with an air of calm that masked the turmoil inside him. He felt like a puppeteer whose strings had become tangled. He had carefully planned every detail of Mr. Andrew's disappearance, never imagining the little twists soon to unfold beyond his control. Pulling up in front of the police station, he killed the engine and exhaled, trying to quell the nerves eating him up. He needed to remain collected to pull off his cover story. The local precinct was a worn, grey building, a fitting reflection of the general apathy within. Josh pushed open the glass door and approached the front desk, where a young officer told him to wait. After some time, Commissioner Smith appeared with his usual lazy bearing. His tie was loose, his expression weary, though his face brightened when he recognized Josh, the nephew of a wealthy figure known for bestowing a generous thanks now and again to expedite certain bureaucratic tasks. "Well, if it isn't Josh, what brings you here?" Smith asked, a thin veneer of courtesy overlaying a note of servile deference. "It's about my uncle, Mr. Andrew. I haven't heard from him in days. We had a meeting set up, and ever since then, he's not answering his phone. I've been by his house, but there's no sign of him. I'm really worried something might have happened," Josh explained, feigning genuine concern. The commissioner, well aware of Mr. Andrew's fortune and influence, narrowed his eyes curiously. Still, he kept his casual demeanor, as though the disappearance of a millionaire were a minor inconvenience. "You tried calling his phone? Sometimes older people just take their time and forget to let anyone know," Smith commented, showcasing his usual indifference. Josh pretended to grow impatient. He knew the commissioner wouldn't lift a finger without a good reason or a hefty incentive. "Of course I've tried, but there's no answer. Please, I just want someone to start looking for him or open an investigation. I'd hate to think the worst, but something serious might have happened." Smith pondered a moment, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. He was used to bribes, and with wealthy folks, he had no qualms about being accommodating or turning a blind eye. A subtle grin spread across his lips, and with a small gesture, he invited Josh back to his office. Behind closed doors, they spoke for a few minutes. No one knew exactly what was said, but as they emerged, Smith assured Josh he would do his best to find Mr. Andrew, though he couldn't promise immediate results. Josh, for his part, left with the hope that he had planted the idea that Mr. Andrew simply walked off, so nobody would look too closely. Yet, as Josh headed for his car, he caught the sharp gaze of a tall, thin man wearing a dark trench coat. It was Detective Prieto, an investigator from the capital assigned to help on special cases. From the moment Prieto saw Josh, he sensed an odd tension in the way he moved. Something about Mr. Andrew's nephew struck him as suspicious. Though Prieto didn't know Josh personally, He had heard of the powerful textile magnate and his family. Seeing Josh leave Smith's office in what appeared to be complicity piqued his detective instincts. "Good afternoon," Prieto greeted politely. "Apologies for interrupting, but I thought I heard you mention Mr. Andrew. Are you a relative?" Josh, not expecting anyone else to query him, furrowed his brow before forcing a pleasant smile. "Yes, I'm his nephew. I just reported that my uncle has disappeared, but the commissioner says there's nothing conclusive," he replied, trying to sound convincing. Prieto nodded silently, his gaze fixed on Josh, as though trying to decipher each subtle shift in the man's expression. Then, with a courteous gesture, he said goodbye, leaving the door open for a future conversation. Privately, the detective felt a jolt of interest, as if this case had sparked a curiosity he could not ignore. Meanwhile, back at the family home, Laura and Rick heard the news of Mr. Andrew's disappearance with disbelief and worry. Laura, who had had harsh arguments with her father, was seized by a mix of guilt and fear. What if something terrible had happened? And what if she never had the chance to reconcile with him? Rick wrestled with his usual passivity versus the need to act. Both were stunned that Josh, who rarely showed much family devotion, had taken the initiative to report Mr. Andrew's absence to the police. "Do you really think Dad would just leave on his own without telling anyone?" Laura asked, biting her lip and pacing nervously. "I'm not sure. It's odd. He's always been private, but to vanish like this," Rick murmured, shoulders tense. Josh's behavior, on the other hand, caused them confusion. He was overly concerned, as though trying to hide a deeper anxiety. He insisted the police were doing the right thing and that Mr. Andrew had probably run into some mishap, but would surface soon enough. Laura sensed a certain fakery in his tone, and even the less perceptive Rick kept throwing uneasy glances at his nephew. For his part, Josh believed he had everything under control. He had sown the seeds of a disappearance and trusted that Commissioner Smith, with a bit of under-the-table persuasion, would let the matter fall by the wayside. However, the memory of Prieto's inquisitive stare gnawed at him, a reminder that he might not so easily shake off the curiosity of a detective reputed for being incorruptible. This unease began seeping into Josh's mind, though he strove to conceal it from the family by putting on a show of genuine distress, which he hoped would serve as his alibi. From the window of Smith's office, Prieto watched Josh drive away. He planned to investigate, even if on his own. The mysterious case of Mr. Andrew, a rich man gone without notice, rang in his ears like a dark omen. Sometimes, the people closest to you hold the most dangerous secrets, and he had no intention of dismissing a single clue in this tangled situation. Every step would fan his suspicions, pointing straight at Josh. Mr. Andrew woke to shadows and the low hum of hushed voices. His surroundings felt unfamiliar: a rough wooden ceiling, rustic walls, the heavy smell of herbs and improvised medical supplies. He blinked slowly, head throbbing painfully. His eyes, used to the luxury of mansions and spotless offices, now scanned a cramped room with raw wood furniture and a single bare light bulb dangling from an old wire. Too weak to sit up, he merely turned his head slightly, trying to make out the figures nearby. Standing by his makeshift bed, he noticed a child watching him intently, worried. It was John, the boy who had dragged him from the river and brought him to Mr. George's cabin. Seeing Mr. Andrew blink, John raised his voice to call Dr. Johnson, who was busy examining a few bottles on a small table. She hurried over, checking her patient's pulse. "He's still in a delicate state, but he's showing signs of recovery," the doctor said quietly, addressing both the child and Mr. George, who stood in the corner on alert. With a faint voice, Mr. Andrew asked where he was. In halting sentences, John explained that they had found him hurt under a bridge and brought him to the cabin to treat him and keep away anyone who might try to harm him again. The old man blinked in confusion, trying to piece together the final images in his mind. He remembered being coerced into a meeting with Josh, the heated argument, and then the brutal fall into the water. An icy rage coursed through his chest as he realized clearly that his nephew had not saved him, but rather hurled him off that bridge on purpose. "Who brought me here?" he managed to whisper. John, modestly, answered that he had seen the old man falling and couldn't let him die. Despite his own frailty, Mr. Andrew locked eyes on the boy, sensing the generosity in those wide, frightened eyes. In a weak voice, he expressed his thanks, unable to fully grasp how a total stranger, much less a mere child, had found the strength to save him from death's door. Silence settled heavily in the cabin until Eusebio stepped forward, solemn, to fill in the rest of the story. "From what the kid says," the ex-soldier began, "someone pushed you from that bridge. You got here unconscious, with wounds to the head and body. If this was an attempted murder, whoever did it might come back to finish the job." Mr. Andrew shut his eyes in pain. He needed no further explanation. Josh, his own nephew, had tried to kill him. Recalling that moment filled him with both outrage and grief, yet he could barely keep his eyes open. He also realized something more pressing was at hand. He had to stay hidden until he regained enough strength to defend himself, and most importantly, report Josh to the proper authorities. Once Dr. Johnson finished checking his wounds, Mr. Andrew, voice trembling, asked to speak with John alone. Eusebio and the doctor left the room, leaving the two in a situation of forced intimacy. It took the old man several seconds to find his words. "Tell me, child, why did you do this for me?" he asked, eyeing the boy with his weary gaze. John shrugged, embarrassed, as though he didn't have a clear answer. Still, he explained the basics. He had gone fishing in secret because his family was struggling, and he stumbled upon that terrible scene by the river. He couldn't let someone die, no matter who it was. Without giving it much thought, he decided to save him. "What if the person who pushed me comes back for me?" pressed the old man, trying to gauge the boy's resolve. "We'll hide you," John replied in a faint voice. "Mr. George promised to protect you, and the doctor also said that as long as you're recovering, no one will know you're alive." Mr. Andrew nodded, realizing at least there was a rudimentary plan. Each breath sent a sharp pain through his ribs, but he clung to life with a new goal: survive long enough to unmask Josh. Still, merely protecting himself wasn't his only worry. He suddenly recalled the hours before the incident, his nephew's growing hostility, Josh's secret phone calls, and rumors of debts to a shady investor. Now it all made sense. The motive for the crime was to seize control of the company, his coveted inheritance. That was when John, staring at the floor, took the chance to admit something weighing on him. His mother, Rosa, was sick and deeply in debt to a loan shark who was threatening to evict them. The boy was hoping that if Mr. Andrew recovered, he might help them in some way. Even so, he didn't want to push too hard, knowing the old man was still very weak. Those words echoed in Mr. Andrew's ears like the memory of his own humble childhood, one he had left behind decades ago. He suddenly realized he had spent far too long on public philanthropic deeds, grand openings, and headline-worthy donations, while overlooking the harsh reality faced by families like John's. He took the boy's hand with what little strength he had left and replied, voice trembling just slightly, "I promise that if I get through this, I'll do whatever I can to help you and your family. But for now, we have a pact. No one must know I'm alive until I'm back on my feet and can bring the culprit to justice." John agreed, understanding that this old man was now not only someone who needed protection, but also a potential lifeline for his mother and younger sister. They resolved to keep it a secret, even from Rosa. Only Mr. George and the doctor would know the details. The boy left a little while later, promising to return the next day. Exhausted, Mr. Andrew closed his eyes and felt a calm wave wash over him despite the pain. He had found an unlikely but brave ally who would help him face the aftermath of his nephew's crime. As night settled over the cabin, Mr. Andrew pondered his family's situation, his company, and the impoverished neighborhoods he had tried to support from a distance. For the first time, he felt he truly recognized the face of need, embodied by a young boy who barely had enough for himself, yet had risked everything to save him. That bond, sealed by a vow of silence, would form the basis of a new destiny for them both. Rosa couldn't recall the last time she had slept well. The fever kept her restless, and the headaches she had endured for weeks only grew worse each day. Still, nothing troubled her as much as the constant threats from Nicholas, the loan shark brazen enough to demand a staggering interest rate on the money she'd borrowed for medicine and to feed her children. Her small home of thin metal sheets felt more fragile than ever, as though the walls shook with every blow that Nicholas or his henchmen landed on the door. That afternoon, Nicholas arrived in his usual intimidating style, flanked by two burly men. Without so much as a greeting, he shoved the door open and took up position in the middle of the cramped living room. Rosa, sprawled on a rickety armchair, could barely sit up. She was breathing heavily, a damp cloth on her forehead failing to contain her fever. Despite feeling awful, she tried not to let her voice tremble. "I don't have all the money," Rosa admitted, feeling her heart tighten. "I've only managed to scrape together part of it." Nicholas gave her a menacing glare. He was a man with harsh features, a thick moustache, sharply defined eyebrows, and his eyes always gleamed with cruelty whenever he sensed weakness in his debtors. "It's always the same story, Rosa," he spat, voice laced with sarcasm. "And I'm no charity. I want my money, and I want it soon, or I'll have to kick you out. Got it?" Rosa swallowed hard. Part of her wanted to beg for more time, but she knew Nicholas's reputation all too well. Tears and pleas never moved him. He did, however, accept small, partial payments to keep the debt alive and the interest piling up. In fact, taking her home wouldn't be a bad deal for him either. Seeing the thugs poking around every corner, Rosa felt her dignity hanging by a thread. As the loan shark and his men left, John slipped in through the back door. He had been searching for fish in a nearby puddle, with little luck. Noticing the filthy footprints and the lingering smell of Nicholas's tobacco, he instantly knew something was wrong. He found his mother frowning, head in her hands. "Are you all right, Mum?" the boy asked, drawing closer. Rosa forced a faint smile. She didn't want to burden her son with her problems, but he had grown used to hearing her woes and trying to console her. "They came to collect again," she managed to say, sighing. The worst part was the defeated look in her eyes. "They say I've got very little time left to pay." John's heart thumped. He remembered the old man still recovering in Mr. George's cabin and the vow of secrecy he had made to protect him. Telling his mother the truth could endanger both Mr. Andrew and himself. Yet their need for money was becoming more desperate every day. For a moment, he wondered if perhaps that wealthy man he'd saved might help repay his mother's debt. But the old man was still in bad shape, and there was no guarantee yet it was safe to tell the whole story. Making matters worse, each time Nicholas showed up, John worried someone might ask how he managed to get the few coins he sometimes brought home. His mother assumed he ran errands at the market or found odd jobs for neighbors, unaware that he was risking his neck by fishing illegally, much less that he had become the impromptu rescuer of a nearly murdered magnate. That night, as Rosa dozed fitfully in feverish sweats and Luli slept on the adjacent bed, John perched on a small wooden stool, staring into space. He thought about how to keep the secret and still help his mother. The idea of going to the cabin and demanding that Mr. Andrew fulfill his promise seemed too forward. After all, the old man could barely stand, and he still hadn't openly revealed who had pushed him. In fact, the whole matter was shrouded in silence. The boy felt trapped in a maze of lies. He had to pretend with his mother and sister and hide his worries from Mr. George and Dr. Johnson, who seemed far more focused on keeping Mr. Andrew safe than on his family's hardships. Worse yet, he sensed someone might discover his double life. If the police found out he was under the bridge the same afternoon Mr. Andrew vanished, he'd be dragged into a scandal he could not afford. Every time he closed his eyes, he relived the scene. That man plunging into the water after being shoved, the terrible crash against the rocks. He wondered who the attacker was and why he had done it. He thought about Mr. Andrew's expensive clothes, his fragile yet well-cared-for hands, and the pained expression on his unconscious face. Even without knowing his full identity, John sensed he was someone of great importance. Under the metal roof, the night wind howled as though warning of hidden dangers. John pulled a thin blanket around himself for warmth and watched his mother shiver with fever. A lump formed in his throat, and he realized time was running out. Nicholas could return any moment with fresh threats, and if they couldn't come up with the money, they'd lose what little they had. This child, carrying the weight of his family on his shoulders, understood that his secret nighttime fishing trips were no longer enough. He needed a bigger, faster solution, and the only thing that came to mind was seeking help from the old man he had rescued. But how to approach him without endangering his life? How to ask for help from someone who couldn't yet fend for himself? As night fell over the impoverished neighborhood, John clenched his teeth, determined not to give up. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would find a way to help his mother. Perhaps he would seek out the ex-soldier or the doctor and explain how urgent the situation was, hoping they might have a better idea. Still, this burden was growing unbearable for a 10-year-old boy juggling a secret far too big for his age and dreading each dawn's potential ultimatum from Nicholas. In that fragile setting, bravery and desperation mixed in his chest, pushing him onward even if he had no clue how much longer he could bear the strain without collapsing. Nightfall cloaked the makeshift office Martin Baeza had set up on a high floor in the city's commercial district. The room, draped in heavy curtains and dimly lit, seemed tailored for deals no one wanted exposed to daylight. Josh arrived there wearing a grim frown, fully aware that his situation was growing more complicated by the minute. He knew that if Baeza demanded immediate repayment, he wouldn't be able to deliver unless he gained access to his uncle's fortune. But Mr. Andrew remained missing, and until he was legally declared absent or deceased, Josh had no direct path to the inheritance. "You're behind on your deadlines," Baeza snapped the instant Josh sat down across from him. "You assured me that in a matter of days you'd have control of the company. I see no sign of that happening." Josh registered the dry, menacing tone and swallowed hard. He noted the stack of papers Baeza was casually leafing through, likely the documents listing each installment, each interest rate, each suffocating clause Josh had signed. He did his best to hide any trace of weakness. "Believe me, I'm doing everything I can," Josh murmured, hoping to sound self-assured. "My uncle is very influential. Even if he doesn't show up, we can't declare him dead until the legal waiting period's over. But soon, very soon, I'll get what's mine." Baeza let out a harsh laugh. Leaning back in his chair, he studied Josh with a predator's gaze. "And how do you plan on making that happen? Get a judge to issue a death certificate without a body?" he mocked, clearly skeptical. "Look, I don't care how you do it. I just want my money back. If I don't get it, you and I have a big problem." Josh fell silent for a few seconds, choosing his words carefully. He knew that if he said too much, Baeza might suspect he was certain Mr. Andrew wouldn't return. Yet if he offered no assurance, the investor might take drastic action. Finally, he ventured, "Give me a few more weeks. I'm trying to free up some company funds, but I'm running into obstacles. Laura, Mr. Andrew's daughter, and my uncle Rick are standing in the way." Baeza glanced at his watch, feigning impatience, then leveled a threatening look at Josh. "I'll give you very little time, and if I don't see results, you and I will be renegotiating our terms." With that ominous line, the meeting ended. Josh left the building with a knot in his gut. He walked to his car, fully aware that unless Mr. Andrew was officially declared dead, he couldn't take legal control of the company. Even so, he wondered if he could orchestrate some shady financial maneuver, sell shares, forge signatures, or even siphon money from bank accounts. But for any of that, He needed signatures from Mr. Andrew, Laura, or Rick on key documents. That same week, Josh began showing up more frequently at the company's main offices. He claimed he was concerned about his uncle's disappearance and wanted to ensure business continued smoothly. Moving briskly and wearing a serious expression, he entered boardrooms and pored over accounting documents that, under normal circumstances, would not have been accessible to him. Most employees, used to the near-mythical presence of Mr. Andrew, eyed Josh's sudden involvement with suspicion, but no one dared challenge him outright. His first underhanded tactic emerged when Josh tried to sell a block of shares at below market value, needing quick cash to partially meet Baeza's demands. However, he ran into a roadblock. Laura, upon hearing about the possible transaction, rushed to the legal department to put a stop to it. "You can't sell shares without proper authorization," Laura confronted him, raising her voice. "We have no evidence my father ever delegated those kinds of decisions to you." They clashed head-on. Josh, breathing heavily to contain his anger, shot back that it was crucial to keep the company afloat while Mr. Andrew was missing, and that he had proof of being granted special powers by his uncle. Laura, who had always resented her father's emotional distance, was no fool when it came to business. She had her own training and could spot a dubious move. "If you want to run this company, you'll have to produce an actual document. Otherwise, I'll go to a judge to block any transactions." Josh was left speechless. He pressed his lips together, trying not to blow up in front of the staff. Laura, chin held high and gaze unwavering, left before he could reply. "Tell me, child, why did you do this for me?" he asked, gazing at the boy with weary eyes. John shrugged, abashed, as if he had no clear answer. Still, he explained the basics. He had gone fishing in secret because his family was struggling, and he happened upon the terrible scene of the fall. He could not let someone die, no matter how much of a stranger they might be. And so, without much thought, he decided to save him. "What if whoever pushed me comes back for me?" the old man persisted, attempting to measure the boy's resolve. "We'll hide you," John replied in a hushed tone. "Mr. George promised to protect you, and the doctor also said that, while you recover, no one will know you're alive." Mr. Andrew nodded, sensing that at least there was the start of a plan. Each breath sent a sharp pain through his ribs, yet he clung to life with a new purpose: survive in order to unmask Josh. Still, defending himself was not his only concern. He suddenly recalled the hours leading up to the incident, his nephew's growing hostility, Josh's secret phone calls, and rumors of debts to a shady investor. It all made sense now. The motive for the crime was to seize control of the company, the long-coveted inheritance. It was then that John, staring at the floor, seized the chance to confess something weighing on him. His mother, Rosa, was ill and in debt to a loan shark who threatened to evict them. The boy hoped that if Mr. Andrew recovered, he might help them somehow. Yet John didn't want to push him, knowing the old man was still very weak. Those words echoed in Mr. Andrew's ears like a memory of his own humble childhood, which he had left behind decades ago. Suddenly, he realized he had spent far too long tending to public philanthropic acts, grand openings and media-hyped donations, while overlooking the raw reality of families like John's. Taking the boy's hand with what little strength he had left, he responded with a nearly imperceptible tremor in his voice. "I swear that if I make it through this, I'll do whatever I can to help you and your family. But for now, we have a pact. No one must know I'm alive until I can recover and accuse the guilty party." John agreed, aware that this old man had become not only someone to protect, but possibly the salvation for his mother and sister. They pledged to keep the secret, even from Rosa. Only Mr. George and the doctor would know the details. The boy left a while later, promising to return the next day. Worn out, Mr. Andrew closed his eyes and felt a wave of calm despite the pain. He had found a young ally, as unexpected as he was brave, who would help him confront the consequences of his nephew's crime. As night fell over the cabin, Mr. Andrew reflected in silence on his family's situation, on the company, and on the impoverished neighborhoods he had supposedly aided from afar. For the first time, he felt he truly saw the real face of need, embodied by a boy who barely had enough to survive but had risked everything to save him. That bond, sealed by their vow of silence, would form the foundation of a new destiny for both of them. Rosa could not remember the last time she had slept soundly. Fevers gave her no peace, and the headaches she had endured for weeks only seemed to grow more severe each day. Yet nothing worried her so much as the constant threats from Nicholas, the loan shark brazen enough to demand outrageous interest on the money she had borrowed to buy medicine and keep food on the table for her children. Their little house of thin metal sheets felt increasingly fragile, as though the walls shook with every pound delivered by Nicholas or his henchmen. That afternoon, Nicholas arrived in his usual intimidating manner, flanked by two bulky men. Without so much as a greeting, he shoved the door open and positioned himself in the middle of the cramped living room. Rosa, slumped on a shabby armchair, could barely sit up. She was breathing heavily, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead that failed to bring down her fever. Despite her discomfort, she tried to hide any quiver in her voice. "I don't have all the money," Rosa admitted, feeling her heart shrink. "I've only managed to gather a part of it." Nicholas glared at her. He was a man with rough features, a thick mustache, heavy eyebrows, and there always seemed to be a spark of cruelty in his eyes whenever he smelled weakness in his debtors. "Always the same story, Rosa," he scoffed, voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm no charity. I want my money as soon as possible, or I'll have to kick you out. Got it?" Rosa swallowed hard. Part of her wanted to beg for more time, but she knew Nicholas's reputation all too well. Tears and pleas never swayed him. He did, however, accept small, partial payments that kept the debt alive and the interest piling up. Indeed, taking ownership of the house wouldn't be a bad deal for him either. As she saw the thugs snooping around every corner, Rosa felt her dignity hanging by a thread. Once the loan shark and his men were gone, John came in through the back door. He had been looking for fish in a nearby puddle, with little success. The muddy footprints and the lingering smell of Nicholas's tobacco were all he needed to see. Something was wrong. He found his mother frowning, head in her hands. "Are you all right, Mom?" the boy asked, drawing closer. Rosa forced a faint smile. She did not want to share her burden with her son, but he had long grown used to hearing her troubles and trying to comfort her. "They came by to collect again," she sighed. The worst part was the defeated look in her eyes. "They say I don't have much time to pay." John's heart pounded. He thought of the old man recovering in Mr. George's cabin and of the secrecy vow he had made to protect him. Telling his mother the truth could endanger both Mr. Andrew's life and his own. Still, their need for money grew more desperate by the day. For a moment, he wondered if perhaps the wealthy man he'd rescued might help repay his mother's debt. But the old man was still in bad shape, and there was no certainty yet that it was safe to disclose everything. Worse, every time Nicholas showed up, John feared someone would ask where he got the coins he sometimes brought home. His mother assumed he ran errands at the market or did odd jobs for neighbors. She had no idea her son was risking his life fishing illegally, let alone that he had become an impromptu savior of a nearly murdered magnate. That night, as Rosa dozed in fevered sweats and Luli slept on the adjacent bed, John sat on a small wooden stool, staring into space. He thought about how to keep the secret and help his mother at the same time. The mere notion of going to the cabin to demand that Mr. Andrew uphold his promise seemed too abrupt. The old man could barely stand, and he had yet to reveal openly who had pushed him. Everything was still tightly under wraps. The boy felt trapped in a maze of lies. He had to pretend around his mother and sister. He had to hide his anxiety from Mr. George and Dr. Johnson, who seemed more concerned with Mr. Andrew's safety than his own family's struggles. On top of that, he dreaded the possibility that someone might discover his double life. If the police learned he had been under the bridge the same afternoon Mr. Andrew disappeared, they would drag him into a scandal he couldn't handle. Whenever he closed his eyes, he replayed the scene. That man being shoved into the water, the heart-rending crash against the rocks. He wondered who had done it and why. He thought of Mr. Andrew's expensive clothes, his weakened but well-cared-for hands, and the anguish frozen on his unconscious face. Even without knowing his full identity, John sensed he was important. Under the tin roof, the night wind whistled relentlessly, like a murmur of warning. John pulled a thin blanket around himself, trying to keep warm, and glanced over at his mother, still shivering with fever. A lump formed in his throat, aware that time was running out. Nicholas could return any moment with more threats, and if they couldn't gather the money, they would lose what little they had. This 10-year-old, carrying the weight of his family on his shoulders, realized that clandestine fishing was no longer enough. He needed a bigger, faster solution, and the only thing that came to mind was turning to the old man he had rescued. But how could he do it without endangering him further? How could he ask for help from someone who could barely protect himself? As darkness pressed in on the impoverished neighborhood, John clenched his teeth, determined not to give up. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would find a way to help his mother. He would seek out the ex-soldier or the doctor and explain the urgency of his situation, hoping they had a better plan. Still, that emotional burden was becoming unbearable for a child of only 10, weighed down by a secret far too large for his years and the terror that every sunrise might bring a new ultimatum from Nicholas. In that precarious environment, courage and despair mingled in his chest, driving him forward, though he had no idea how long he could bear the pressure without breaking. Nightfall crept over the makeshift office Martin Baeza had set up on an upper floor in the city's commercial district. With its heavy curtains and sparse lighting, the place seemed designed for deals nobody wanted to bring into daylight. It was here that Josh arrived, brow furrowed, all too aware that his situation was growing ever more complicated. He knew that if Baeza demanded immediate repayment, he could not deliver without first accessing his uncle's fortune. But Mr. Andrew was still missing, and until he was legally declared absent or deceased, Josh had no direct path to the inheritance. "You're behind schedule," Baeza snapped the moment Josh sat down across from him. "You assured me that in a matter of days you'd have control of the company. I'm not seeing that happen." Josh heard the dry, threatening edge in his voice and swallowed hard. He glanced at the thick bundle of papers Baeza was flipping through with feigned disinterest, likely the documents listing every payment, every interest rate, every suffocating clause Josh had signed. He tried not to show weakness. "Believe me, I'm doing everything possible," Josh murmured, hoping to sound confident. "My uncle's a very influential man. Even if he doesn't turn up, we can't declare him dead until the legal time has passed. But soon, very soon, I'll get what's mine." Baeza let out a hoarse laugh. He leaned back in his chair, staring at Josh with a predator's gaze. "And how are you going to pull that off? Get a judge to sign a death certificate without a body?" he sneered, clearly skeptical. "Look, I don't care about the details. I just want my money back. If I don't get it, you and I have a serious problem." Josh was silent for a few seconds, weighing his next words. He knew that if he spoke too hastily, Baeza might suspect he was certain Mr. Andrew wouldn't return. On the other hand, if he failed to offer some guarantee, the investor could take drastic measures. Finally, he ventured, "Give me a few more weeks. I'm trying to free up some company funds, but I'm running into roadblocks. Laura, Mr. Andrew's daughter, and Rick, my uncle, keep getting in the way." Baeza checked his watch, faking impatience, then shot Josh a threatening glance. "I'll give you very little time, very little. If I don't see results, you and I will have to renegotiate our terms." With that ominous decree, the meeting ended. Josh left the building with a knot in his stomach. He walked to his car knowing that, without Mr. Andrew being declared dead, he couldn't legally take over the company. Still, he thought he might orchestrate some financial gambit, selling shares, forging signatures, or even siphoning cash from corporate accounts. But for any of that, he needed Mr. Andrews', Laura's, or Rick's signatures on key documents. That same week, Josh started showing up more frequently at the company's main offices. He excused himself by claiming concern for his uncle's disappearance and insisting he needed to ensure the business stayed afloat. With quick steps and a stern expression, he slipped into boardrooms and combed through accounting documents that would normally be off-limits. Most of the employees, used to the near-legendary presence of Mr. Andrew, viewed Josh's sudden involvement with suspicion, yet no one dared confront him openly. His first dishonest move was to attempt selling a block of shares below market price. He needed quick liquidity to at least partially meet Baeza's demands. But he hit a wall. Laura, after catching wind of the planned transaction, went straight to the legal department to block it. "You can't sell shares without authorization," she confronted him, raising her voice. "We have no proof my father delegated that kind of decision to you." The clash was head-on. Josh, breathing hard to keep his temper in check, retorted that it was imperative to maintain the company's finances in Mr. Andrews' absence and that he had evidence his uncle had given him special powers. Laura, who had always resented her father's emotional distance, was no novice in business matters. She had her own training and knew a shady move when she saw one. "If you want to run this company, you'll need a legitimate document," she fired back. "Otherwise, I'll speak to a judge and have any transaction frozen." Josh was left speechless. He pressed his lips together, trying not to lose his temper in front of the staff. Laura, chin held high and gaze resolute, walked away before giving him the chance to respond. On his part, Rick, who normally stayed out of family disputes, was beginning to feel uneasy about the situation. Josh kept insisting he support the sale of company shares to free up funds. In return, he promised him future financial compensation. But Rick wavered between his usual passivity and the certainty that something smelled fishy. "I can't sign anything until my brother turns up or we find out what really happened to him," Rick said once, looking nervous. "Don't you think it's strange that he just vanishes overnight, as if nothing happened?" Josh hid his annoyance behind a conciliatory smile. "That's exactly why we need to make sure the business doesn't fall apart. Uncle Andrew wouldn't want us losing money or missing payments. It's better to get ahead of any financial disaster." Josh's words failed to convince Rick, who sensed his nephew wasn't being entirely honest. Still, he lacked the courage to stand up to him more firmly. The most he dared do was postpone putting pen to paper. Every day he came up with a fresh excuse to avoid giving Josh the endorsement he needed. Meanwhile, Laura, keeping a close eye on her cousin's actions, began quietly tracking the paper trail of documents he was handling. She discovered that Josh had visited a private bank several times and had even set up meetings with unusual suppliers. Everything suggested he was working towards some hidden goal, probably looking for a way to siphon money from the company without leaving too many tracks. In this climate of intrigue and mistrust, Josh felt cornered. He needed Mr. Andrews' signature or a legal pronouncement declaring him permanently absent. Without either, his efforts to free up funds were thwarted at every turn. And all the while, Martin Baeza's shadow loomed over him, reminding him that time was running short, and sooner rather than later, he would have to show results. Thus, the financial trap Josh had set for himself began closing in, threatening not only his ambition, but also the company's stability. With Laura scrutinizing his every move and Rick doubting everything, each day became a race against the clock, full of secret maneuvers and clandestine meetings. Unable to retreat, Josh ventured down an increasingly dark path, convinced he only needed one lucky break, the official declaration of Mr. Andrews' death, to free himself from the very chains he had forged. Mr. George closed the cabin door and leaned his forehead against the wood, letting out a sigh that had been building up for days. The forest's silence surrounded him, broken only by the occasional bird call or the snap of dry branches in the wind. Inside, Dr. Johnson was tidying up a few bottles and bandages after checking on Mr. Andrew. Although the old man was improving, he still needed time before he could walk unaided. John visited him daily, always evasive, always worried about his mother's debt, though never losing that brave look in his eyes. Eusebio, for his part, remained on guard 24 hours a day, ensuring no one snooped around. At night, he set up basic traps along the dirt path that led to the cabin and inspected each footprint in the mud to make sure there were no unwanted visitors. He had spent years living in this self-imposed solitude, convinced he deserved a lonely life because of decisions he had made in the past. Outside, seated on a fallen log, the ex-soldier lit a cigarette. The smoke rose in slow spirals, and his thoughts drifted to a time long gone. He remembered vividly the days when he wore his uniform with pride, firmly believing in protecting civilians and upholding the values instilled in him during training. Yet that unbreakable faith was shattered the day he was ordered to bomb a rebellious town that not only housed insurgents, but also entire families hidden in their homes. Eusebio, who led a small squad, refused to carry out the order upon realizing it would sacrifice innocent civilian lives. His decision to disobey cost him his career and a reputation that had been unblemished until then. The memory was bitter. He had been tried by a disciplinary council, which branded his insubordination as treason. He appealed to ethical principles, but higher-ups needed a scapegoat to cover up the strategic blunders of the mission. Although he prevented a massacre, his superiors made sure to kick him out in disgrace, tarnishing his name. Ever since, he had borne the guilt and shame of being unable to save everyone, unable to convince his top-ranking colleagues how absurd that order had been. The first person to learn his true story, once he had exiled himself, was Dr. Johnson. She arrived in the region shortly after he settled into the cabin, and, from the start, noticed something unusual in the way Eusebio communicated. Always polite, but with a sadness in his eyes that didn't fit a simple retired farmer. Her intuition led her to ask him carefully, without pressing. Over time, Eusebio revealed fragments of his past: the unjust expulsion, his failure to defend his name in a rigged military trial, and the deep moral wound that gave him no peace. "You did the right thing by refusing to fire on civilians," the doctor told him once, looking him in the eye. "I know that, and maybe you do too. Your conscience shouldn't torment you." Eusebio said nothing, but his silence said it all. It was hard for him to believe in his own innocence when his service record was stamped with "dismissed," and his future had collapsed overnight. However, that evening, while smoking outside the cabin, he realized that what he was doing for John and Mr. Andrew offered him a chance for atonement. Though it couldn't erase his past, perhaps he could build a more honorable present. Dr. Johnson emerged from the cabin and approached him, her jacket still soiled with dirt. She stood by his side for a moment, not saying a word. She understood Eusebio's routine and respected his silences. The two of them shared a tacit understanding, a bond forged by compassion and a mutual pursuit of justice. After a few seconds, she spoke up. "How are you handling all this?" she asked, folding her arms against the cool night air. "All right. I just want to make sure the old man leaves my cabin alive," Eusebio replied, giving a barely perceptible smile. "And I want John to be safe." The doctor heard a note of resolve in his voice. That certainty in his current mission contrasted with the turmoil that had so recently plagued him. It was as though protecting Mr. Andrew and the boy had restored his sense of purpose. The ex-soldier felt that by staying alert to every sound, every detail, and keeping watch so Josh's henchmen, or a loan shark's men, didn't show up, he was fulfilling a moral duty. Perhaps it wasn't so different from the days when he guarded civilians' safety, except now his battlefield was a silent forest and his squad was reduced to a wounded old man and a poor child. "You're showing that you're still a man of honor," the doctor said, gazing at the dark sky. She knew those words could either comfort him or unsettle him, but she felt they needed to be said. Eusebio felt a faint tingling in his chest upon hearing that. It had been years since anyone described him in terms that evoked honor or bravery. He had grown used to thinking of himself as a fugitive from his own past. But seeing the gratitude and trust in John's eyes made him realize there was a renewed chance to serve a just cause. Saving Mr. Andrew, keeping him safe from a heinous crime, and giving that boy hope that his mother could stay under a decent roof were acts that, in some way, eased the burdens of guilt he carried. Over the following days, Eusebio worked to strengthen that protection. He set more animal traps around the area, gathered supplies, and took on any medication Dr. Johnson provided. He also had brief conversations with Mr. Andrew, who, still reserved, revealed bits of his life in business and the betrayal he had suffered at the hands of his own nephew. Eusebio kept his reactions to himself, but couldn't help empathizing with the old man who, though a magnate, needed help as much as, if not more than, the civilians Eusebio had once tried to protect. Thus, as the cabin became a refuge where past and present stories intertwined, Mr. George began rediscovering himself. The old soldier, dishonorably discharged and branded a traitor, felt that his simple actions, lighting a fire to heat water, peering out the window each midnight to stand guard, straightening the blankets of an injured man, were tiny victories over despair. And Dr. Johnson, quiet yet steadfast, encouraged him to believe that in each gesture he was forging a new opportunity to be the man he had always aspired to be, someone who defended life, even at the cost of his own peace. Detective Preto felt like a salmon swimming upstream. Ever since he arrived in the small district to investigate Mr. Andrew's disappearance, he kept stumbling over Commissioner Smith's apathy. The first sign something was off came from the police chief's almost indifferent demeanor. In theory, the disappearance of a prominent magnate should have set off all the alarms, but Smith, with a lazy shrug and a forced grin, downplayed any possibility of foul play. "He probably took a trip without telling anyone. He's known to do that," the commissioner would say, adjusting his worn tie. "Powerful folks like to vanish every so often." Prieto wasn't buying it. He had handled too many cases not to know when appearances were deceiving. He realized Smith was blocking his requests for interrogations and neglecting to log certain calls. Worse yet, some of the reports Prieto requested took days to arrive, or simply went missing. In time, he caught wind of the corruption and bribery rumors swirling around Smith and realized finding Mr. Andrew would be anything but straightforward. Even so, Prieto was tenacious. He insisted on doing things his way, gathering facts on his own. First, he decided to visit the bridge where, according to vague statements, Josh and Mr. Andrew had been seen together. He laced up his boots, donned a coat, and set out toward the outskirts of town, following an old dirt path leading to a wooden structure. The place had an abandoned feel to it, the boards worn by humidity and the railing half broken. Once there, the detective scoured the bridge inch by inch, leaning down to examine the cracks and battered surface. By midday, he noticed a few small dark stains on the wood. He knelt to get a closer look and felt a chill on realizing they might be traces of blood, almost invisible, hidden under dirt. He pressed a handkerchief gently against the stain, hoping the lab could confirm what it was. Moving toward the bank, he spotted something else, footprints that seemed too small for an adult. Bending down again, he noted a partial child's shoe print, muddied but clearly outlined. "A child?" he muttered, taking photos on his phone. He couldn't be sure these tracks had anything to do with the disappearance, yet his instincts told him it was no coincidence. Finishing his inspection, he headed back to the main road and began asking around. He spoke with two farmers passing by in a cart, asking if they had noticed any parked car or suspicious activity in recent days. He got evasive answers, just rumors about a fancy car on the highway with no consensus on the exact day. He didn't give up. He continued asking questions in places closer to town, including a couple of small shops and a local market. There, he heard a stray comment from a vendor who recalled seeing a boy come in soaking wet a few days earlier, looking for food or medicine. The woman wasn't certain, but believed the boy lived in the poor neighborhoods with a sick mother. Prieto jotted down every detail, however minor, as well as the names of a few neighbors who might know the boy's family. Back at the station, Smith met Prieto's preliminary report with a sarcastic attitude. Bloodstains? Probably an animal that got hurt. Child-size footprints? Maybe a kid playing around? Or are you planning on blaming a child for Mr. Andrews' disappearance? The commissioner jeered, shaking his head mockingly. The detective chose not to argue. He knew openly confronting Smith would get him nowhere. His best option was to continue investigating on the sly, piecing together the puzzle bit by bit. That was when a new tip crossed his path. Someone mentioned that Dr. Johnson, renowned in the area for her social work, had treated a critically ill patient in secret. Supposedly, the patient insisted on absolute discretion, to the point that the doctor refused to mention it even to local hospitals. Prieto's alarm bells went off. Could that patient be Mr. Andrew? If he was gravely injured and needed to stay hidden, what reasons lay behind it? Instantly, Prieto began forming theories. Maybe Mr. Andrew hadn't vanished willingly. Maybe he had been attacked. If the doctor was caring for him in secret, perhaps it was out of fear someone would come after him again. Resolved not to tip off Smith, Prieto devised a plan to approach the doctor discreetly. Step 1. Find out her routine, where and when she worked. Step 2. Come up with a plausible excuse to speak to her without raising suspicion. Meanwhile, he thought about the mystery child. Could it be the same kid whose footprints he had found at the bridge? How might a child be tied to a missing textile magnate? The clues were piling up. The blood on the wooden boards, the tiny footprints, the doctor with a hidden patient. Everything suggested that Prieto was facing a more complicated case than expected. Yet the commissioner's corrosive influence kept blocking him from accessing medical records and official statements. Even so, each hurdle only hardened Prieto's resolve. It wasn't his first time dealing with a possibly corrupt superior, and he was determined to see the investigation through to the end. Night fell as Detective Prieto went over his notes once again by the light of an old lamp in the inn where he was staying. He held up the blood sample he had collected at the bridge, remembering the echo of the water running beneath it. Something told him the truth lay there, in that subtle thread linking the deserted bridge, the mysterious child, and the doctor who was quietly caring for a patient. Prieto knew then that sooner or later he would find out what had really happened to Mr. Andrew. And he sensed time was running out, because if that patient was indeed the magnate, he was in serious danger. Laura had spent the entire morning going through old family archives, her mind distracted and her heart uneasy. The uncertainty surrounding Mr. Andrews' whereabouts still weighed heavily on her and Rick, compounded by the shady maneuvers Josh was attempting at the company. Each day without news of her father intensified the tension. The family mansion, large and silent, felt desolate to her now. Even so, she forced herself to keep searching for any clue that might shed light on Mr. Andrews' intentions. Perhaps finding some forgotten document would help her better understand the reasons behind his mysterious disappearance. She headed to the library, a spacious room with tall, dark wood bookcases stretching all the way up to the ceiling. When she was a child, it had been one of her favorite places, though over time she had barely set foot in it. In one corner was a rolling ladder leading to the highest shelves. Laura began inspecting rows of dusty books and old folders. She flipped through law tomes, economics magazines, and various outdated dictionaries her father used when expanding his textile business. Time passed slowly, but she refused to give up. Finally, on a nearly hidden shelf, she found a bundle of papers held together with a metal clip. Leafing through them, she discovered detailed plans and descriptions of an educational project. They mentioned building schools, mobile libraries, and training workshops in disadvantaged neighborhoods. Laura read in amazement the handwritten notes by Mr. Andrew, outlining ideas for scholarships and incentive programs for children in poverty. The old man planned to invest a significant sum into these initiatives, much larger than any previous donation Laura had seen. It wasn't just a sporadic philanthropic act. It appeared to be a large-scale plan to transform the reality of hundreds of families. As she read page after page, her eyes welled with tears, as she realized the personal dedication her father had poured into this project. The notes were extremely detailed about the areas in need and possible collaborators. On one sheet, she recognized the name of Dr. Johnson, whom Mr. Andrew viewed as essential for preventive healthcare efforts in rural areas. Laura felt a twinge of guilt at how little she had appreciated her father during his lifetime. She had always judged him for his distant demeanor and what seemed like disregard for family matters. Yet here she was, discovering a deeper, more visionary side of him. With her heart pounding, she continued sifting through the papers until she came upon a document that took her breath away. A recent will, signed and sealed by a city notary. Her hands trembled when she saw the date, just a few weeks before Mr. Andrew's disappearance. In that will, her father allocated most of his fortune and company shares to the educational project she had just found. It mentioned funds for building schools, purchasing educational materials, and hiring teachers and specialists. Moreover, the will granted only a small portion of the inheritance to Josh, stipulating that if he committed any illegal or flagrantly immoral acts, even that minimal share would be voided. Laura felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Until now, she had believed that despite being philanthropic, her father would never completely leave his family out. Seeing Josh practically disinherited in the document sparked alarm in her mind. What would happen if her cousin discovered the existence of this new will? He had plenty of reasons to want Mr. Andrew out of the picture, especially since without the updated will, Josh might inherit far more. She wondered if he already knew of his uncle's plans, and whether that might be driving his odd behavior and eagerness to have Mr. Andrew declared absent or dead. Deep down, Laura began to realize she might have been unfair to her father. She had always labeled him cold and selfish, when in reality he seemed to have dreamed of leaving behind a legacy far nobler than any honors or accolades. She also understood that if the plan Mr. Andrew had laid out were to come true, the lives of many impoverished people would be radically changed. That included, unbeknownst to her, a boy named John and his family, who would benefit from the old man's social vision. Holding the will in her hands, Laura felt an ever-growing sense of responsibility mixed with uncertainty. She had to be careful. If Josh found out, he could try to destroy the document or retaliate. After stashing the papers in a folder and hiding them again behind a false panel in the bookcase, a clear thought took shape in her mind. She had to protect her father's wishes. It no longer mattered that she and her father had clashed emotionally. She now understood that the project he wanted to leave behind went far beyond family disagreements. Resolute, she left the library with a furrowed brow and her heart pounding. A swirl of wonder, sadness, and admiration stirred within her for a man whom, in a sense, she had longed to get close to, but had failed. He had kept a secret plan to do good for people in need, while his own nephew might be plotting to profit. Laura felt at once more vulnerable and stronger than ever. She stowed the folder in a secure place, aware that within it was the key to defending her father's project, one whose scope even she had not fully grasped. Despite her fears, she would not step back. She would protect that legacy, no matter what. Laura entered the boardroom with a determined stride, carrying under her arm a folder full of papers she had found in the family library. Josh, seated at the head of the table, looked up impatiently, surrounded by a couple of advisors and some employees who didn't know whether to stay or go. The tension was palpable, as the recent disappearance of Mr. Andrew had unsettled every department in the company. No one could understand why Josh insisted on making hasty decisions without the required authorization. "Josh, we need to talk," Laura announced, not beating around the bush. "Now? I'm in the middle of a meeting," he replied, his tone dripping with impatience. Laura refused to be intimidated. She cast a resolute look at those present, making a slight gesture for them to leave the room. Though Josh grimaced, the advisors and employees chose to step out, sensing that this would turn into a delicate family matter. Once the door closed, Laura opened the folder and pulled out several copies of documents, spreading them on the table. Some pages contained outlines for a major educational project in marginalized areas, but the centerpiece was the new will signed by Mr. Andrew. "Where did you get all that?" Josh asked, going pale when he saw the notary seal. "By looking for the truth. I'm fed up with your schemes and your secrets. I found out Father had plans that go beyond the textile business. He intended to dedicate a large part of his assets to a social project, and he put it all in writing in this will, a will that leaves you almost disinherited." Her final words echoed sharply. Josh jumped to his feet, sending his chair skidding back. His expression was a mix of disbelief and fury. For weeks he'd been trying to push Mr. Andrew aside and secure control of the estate, only now to face the harsh reality that his uncle hadn't intended to leave him much of anything. "This can't be," he muttered through clenched fists. "My uncle would never have cut me out of the inheritance." "Maybe he would have, or maybe not. But these papers don't lie," Laura countered, adrenaline coursing through her. "Here he makes his intentions clear. Most of the money would go to the educational project, and if you committed any illegal act, you'd be excluded altogether." Josh tore his gaze from the documents, feeling a knot tighten in his throat. Reality was closing in. If Mr. Andrew returned, brandishing this will, any hope of wealth would slip through his fingers like water. But he couldn't surrender. "That will isn't valid if it was never filed," he insisted, trying to regain composure. "Maybe he changed it again before he went missing." "You sure about that?" Laura cut him off. "There's a notary's seal and a registration date. It's more recent than any other will." At that moment, the door opened and Rick peeked inside, wearing the look of someone who had finally decided to shed his passivity. He had heard raised voices from the corridor and, driven by curiosity and worry, mustered the courage to enter. His eyes ran over the papers on the table, then fixed on Josh's tense face. "What's going on here?" he asked, in a tone more decisive than usual. "Laura found a new will of Dad's," Josh explained, jaw clenched. "According to it, I get practically nothing." Rick blinked in surprise and picked up one of the copies to read it carefully. As he progressed through the text, his expression grew grim. He had always known his brother, Mr. Andrew, was involved in charity work, but he had never suspected such a large-scale social plan. With a sigh, he turned to Laura. "If this document is legitimate, Josh can't sell shares or empty accounts without Mr. Andrew's say-so." "Exactly," Laura confirmed, closing the folder. "And I won't let Josh ignore Father's wishes." Josh wanted to argue, but the words caught in his throat. In recent weeks, he had been fending off pressure from Martin Baeza, a shady creditor who threatened him daily, demanding the money without delay. Now here were Laura and Rick working together, ready to block him at every turn. He felt more cornered than ever. His only hope lay in having Mr. Andrew declared legally dead or definitively missing. But although he wouldn't say it out loud, the mere possibility that the old man was still alive sent a chill through him. Rick, meanwhile, set the documents on the table and, for the first time, faced Josh with a firm tone. "I won't back any share sale until we know what happened to my brother. Laura and I agree on that." A heavy silence fell over the room. Josh swallowed, fully aware of how dire things had become. Inside him, a storm of thoughts raged. Baeza's threats, the possibility that Mr. Andrew might reappear with proof of his betrayal, and now his relatives blocking his plans. If he didn't raise the money soon, Baeza would come down on him. And if Mr. Andrew remained hidden, any police investigation might uncover the truth about the bridge. "No one will move a single cent until we find out what happened to Dad," Laura reiterated, gathering the papers with resolve. "You'd better get used to that idea." Josh clenched his teeth, yet kept up a facade of calm. He merely bowed his head, feigning compliance. In reality, his mind was spinning in search of an alternate plan. He still believed there was a chance Mr. Andrew had died in the fall, but if not, he needed to find him as soon as possible. He knew Baeza was growing impatient, that the family was watching him closely, and that every passing second without control brought him one step closer to ruin. As Laura and Rick left the room, relieved to have thwarted another scheme by their cousin, Josh remained, staring at the wall with a grim look. His mind raced with a new strategy. He clung to the possibility that Mr. Andrew had indeed perished. But if that was not the case, he had to locate him at all costs before the walls closed in for good. At that moment, he clearly understood that the conspiracy he had woven against his uncle was more complicated than he had imagined. Still, there was no turning back. As he clenched his fists, he repeated to himself that, in the end, he would do whatever it took to rid himself of the threats closing in on him. Beyond the room, Laura and Rick's footsteps echoed like a countdown to an increasingly turbulent finale. El Tuco and Fabio, two men with rough appearances and shifty gazes, had been ordered to scour the rural area for an injured old man. No one knew for sure whom they worked for, but rumors linked them to a powerful loan shark or perhaps a shady investor. They wore dark jackets and spoke in low voices, but their very presence instilled fear in the locals. Along every dirt road they traveled, they stopped to ask about an elderly, badly wounded man recently spotted. Some farmers swore they knew nothing, while others, intimidated by threats, admitted seeing an old man under suspicious circumstances. Word that they were searching for a wounded individual soon reached the ears of Mr. George and John, who kept a watchful eye on the area around the cabin. Each time El Tuco and Fabio approached a nearby hamlet, nervous chatter would surface about two strangers offering money for information. Every clue seemed to bring the thugs a little closer to finding Mr. Andrew, who was still convalescing in the cabin, struggling with bouts of fever and weakness. One particularly dark night, with hardly any moon in the sky, El Tuco and Fabio appeared on the main path leading to the cabin. Their steps crunched through dry leaves, and their flashlights raked the brush as though expecting to uncover a telltale trail. Eusebio, ever vigilant, had placed simple traps at strategic points, but he dared not rely on them too heavily. Spotting the faint glow of their flashlights, he switched off all the lights in the house and quietly instructed John to keep Mr. Andrew in the corner farthest from the door. Inside the dwelling, the old man's breathing was labored. His recovery had been slow, and every time his fever spiked, his mind seemed to drift between confused memories and a present full of danger. Dr. Johnson had warned that any sudden shock could worsen his condition. That night, he felt cold air seep through the cracks and sensed John's unease as the boy helped him sit up so he wouldn't make any noise. Mr. Andrew grasped that something serious was happening outside, but lacked the strength to ask out loud. Meanwhile, Eusebio peered through a side window, careful not to lift the curtain too much. He caught sight of the flashlights and the menacing outlines of the two figures prowling around the bushes. "They're here," he thought, his heart pounding. He glanced at John and, with a gesture, signaled him to stay silent and keep watch over Mr. Andrew. The boy nodded, swallowing hard. The thugs drew close enough to study the structure of the cabin. One of them, El Tuco, raised his flashlight to shine it on the windows, noting the darkness and the lack of signs of life. Still, on the damp ground, they could make out disordered footprints, as though someone had been coming and going rather often. Fabio bent down and touched the soil, frowning when he realized it was still fresh. "Looks like someone lives here," he muttered, lifting his eyes to the cabin. "Might just be rumors," El Tuco replied, though he didn't sound too sure. "Still, let's take a look." Eusebio's heart sank. If the men decided to force their way in, he'd have no choice but to confront them. He couldn't allow them to find Mr. Andrew in such a vulnerable state. Besides, if a fight broke out, John would be in danger. For a moment, he imagined the shotgun stowed away in a trunk, though he preferred not to use it. He had carried enough guilt in the past without adding further violence to his conscience. Resolutely, he grabbed a long stick and slipped out the back of the cabin. Once there, he crept into the undergrowth until he was some distance away, then banged the stick against an old metal drum he kept. The clang echoed into the night, setting off distant dogs barking. Startled, El Tuco and Fabio turned their flashlights toward the source of the noise. Eusebio's plan worked. Thinking someone was fleeing, the thugs ran in the opposite direction from the house, heading deeper into the woods. During that interval, Eusebio stealthily returned to the front of the cabin and took cover behind a tree, watching as the men split up to check the area. For several minutes, the tension was unbearable. A heavy silence settled over the forest, broken only by the intruders' cautious steps and the dry snap of twigs beneath their boots. Eusebio bit his lip, fearing that sooner or later they would come back to inspect the cabin. Eventually, after finding nothing, El Tuco and Fabio decided to leave, both scowling. Yet before they disappeared, their words carried clearly to Eusebio's ears. "Maybe we got the wrong place," muttered one. "But if there's an injured man around here, we'll find him. We'll come back soon, with more people if we have to." Once their steps faded into the distance, Eusebio exhaled a sigh of relief that seemed to vanish into the cold air. He went back inside and found John clutching Mr. Andrew's hand. The old man's forehead was drenched in sweat. He opened his eyes briefly, muttering what sounded like an unfinished word of thanks before sinking once more into a hazy, feverish state. "They were way too close," Eusebio whispered, picking up a towel to wipe Mr. Andrew's brow. "I'm not sure how long we can stay hidden." John nodded, his throat tight. He knew that once word spread about an injured man being sheltered somewhere in the hills, the thugs would double their efforts. The boy thought of his sick mother, of the debt to Nicholas, and how the world seemed to be caving in on him. Even so, looking at Mr. Andrew, he realized there was no other option. He and Eusebio would have to hold out, because fleeing would mean leaving the old man to his fate. Thus, as night reclaimed its silence and darkness settled over the cabin, Eusebio and John understood that this was just the beginning of a siege more dangerous than they had ever imagined. El Tuco and Fabio were gone for now, but they would return, and the next time, a distant noise might not be enough to scare them off. Detective Prieto walked through the aisles of the busy marketplace with a furrowed brow, weaving around fruit and vegetable stands while scanning every face. He had received a tip. A vendor recalled seeing a boy who, some days earlier, had been carrying an injured man. Ever since Prieto heard that rumor, he had turned over and over in his mind the possibility that the injured man was Mr. Andrew, the magnate whose disappearance he was investigating. Clinging to a thread of uncertainty and lacking official support, the detective latched onto every lead like a lifeline. He arrived early, blending in with the morning shoppers. He wore a simple jacket and a hat to shield himself from the sun, hoping not to draw too much attention. When he finally found the stall he was looking for, he greeted the vendor with a friendly nod and asked, "Good morning. I was told you saw a boy come by with an injured man a few days ago." "Yes, it was odd. The kid showed up all soaked and on edge," said the vendor, eyeing Prieto warily. He looked exhausted, like he'd been carrying a weight heavier than himself. When I asked if he needed help, he just said he was looking for medicine and some food. Prieto took out a small notebook and jotted down each word. He felt that the description matched what he had heard about the small footprints found at the bridge. It was likely the boy had been there the afternoon Mr. Andrew disappeared, and, even more, that he'd been part of a rescue. Anxiety crept into the detective's voice. "Did you find out where he went afterward? Did he mention any names or places?" "He said something about the river area and talked about his sick mother," the vendor explained, frowning as he tried to remember. "I think a neighbor of his knows them. They must live in the neighborhoods near the dump." With that clue, Prieto pieced together a mental map of the area, marking in his mind the dusty roads and sheet metal shanties where impoverished people likely lived. He thanked the vendor, slipped him a small bill for the trouble of sharing what he knew, and said goodbye. At last, he had a firmer lead. The boy lived with his sick mother in one of the poorer outskirts, and there was a good chance he was the key witness who had eluded him so far. Prieto soon returned to the station to officially report his finding. But the moment he stepped through the door, he ran up against the same wall of hostility as always. Commissioner Smith. With a dismissive air, Smith took a cigarette from his shirt pocket and, after lighting it, spoke in a mocking tone. "Well, Detective, poking your nose in again where it doesn't belong? Still on about how Mr. Andrew might be hurt and hiding out somewhere?" "I have solid evidence suggesting he didn't leave of his own free will," Prieto answered, working to stay calm. "Several witnesses say they've seen an injured man. There are blood traces at the bridge. This looks a lot like an attempted murder." "Blood traces, what a coincidence," the commissioner sneered, puffing smoke. "I've read those reports and see nothing conclusive. Anyway, Mr. Andrew's always been a guy who does whatever he pleases. Maybe he's off in another country having a blast." Prieto bit his tongue to avoid the angry response threatening to burst out. He knew that here, the commissioner wasn't just an inconvenience, he was dangerous. Smith was reputedly corrupt, and over the days, the detective had realized someone was paying him to keep the case buried. Still, Prieto had no intention of giving up. "I'm going to need a couple of officers to come with me to the outskirts." "Don't even dream of it," Smith cut in. "Quit wasting time. This case is going to close under the voluntary disappearance theory. Got it?" The air felt charged enough to cut with a knife. Prieto clenched his fists, aware that if he kept arguing, Smith might formally remove him from the investigation. So he made a drastic decision. He would ignore official orders and continue the case on his own. Without saying goodbye, he left, leaving the commissioner cursing behind puffs of smoke. With the resolve of someone who never looks back, Prieto headed for the impoverished suburbs hugging the city. It took him a while to locate Rosa's home, but questioning neighbors led him to a place where a sick woman supposedly lived with 2 children, a little girl and a boy named John. When he reached the door, he found a precarious setting: sheet metal walls, a dirt floor, and an oppressive silence hanging over everything. He knocked gently, and after a few moments the door opened just a crack. "Sorry to bother you. I'm Detective Prieto. Is this Ms. Rosa's house?" he asked, speaking softly so as not to frighten anyone. "What's this about?" replied a weak female voice. Peering through the gap was a face drawn by fever, Rosa, wrapped in an old blanket, eyes filled with fatigue. Prieto immediately saw how unwell she was. Trying not to overstep, he briefly explained that he was looking into the disappearance of a certain man. He spoke tactfully, without mentioning Mr. Andrew's name or his suspicion of foul play. Yet with each phrase, she shook her head in short, silent denial. "I don't know anything about an injured man, sir," she said, lowering her gaze. "My son and we live alone. We haven't seen anything." "I see," Prieto answered. "But your son, John, has he come home recently with any bruises or odd injuries? Has he mentioned anything out of the ordinary?" Rosa grew visibly uneasy. There was tension in the way she avoided eye contact, in how she clutched the door so Prieto wouldn't see inside. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "John goes fishing sometimes, but I don't know where. He's desperate to earn money because I don't want a loan shark to take our house, but I don't know anything about an injured man." The detective understood that, in part, Rosa was telling the truth. She was unaware of certain details, but also keeping quiet out of fear. He noticed her trembling hands and realized she was on the brink of exhaustion. He chose not to push. Forcing her could shut down any future cooperation. So, in a sympathetic tone, he handed her a card with his number. "If you learn anything, please call me. I don't want to get your son in trouble. I just need to find out the truth." Rosa nodded and quickly closed the door. Prieto lingered for a few seconds, listening to the dusty breeze and feeling time slip away. He carried 2 certainties. First, that this boy named John was key to the case. Second, that his superior, Commissioner Smith, wouldn't stop until the investigation was put to rest. Without wasting another moment, he turned and headed down the street, convinced that he had to act fast. Something in his gut told him that with each day that passed without finding Mr. Andrew, the dark forces bent on silencing him were inching closer to making him disappear for good. Growing rumors circulated in business and police circles. It was said that Mr. Andrew hadn't truly disappeared, but was being hidden somewhere as he recovered from a serious injury. Josh, hounded by debts and blocked at every turn by his family, began to feel the noose tightening around his neck. If the old man was still alive and reappeared with the new will, the whole plan would fall apart. He wouldn't inherit the fortune, he'd lose control of the company, and Baeza would surely make him pay his debt in the cruelest way possible. Overwhelmed by the shady investors' threats, and increasingly certain that Mr. Andrew was concealed in some rural hideout, Josh decided to resort to extreme measures. He remembered hearing testimony about a boy who had been near an injured man by the river. He started putting two and two together, realizing that this boy, John, could be the key to forcing Mr. Andrew to show himself. If he managed to capture the boy and threaten his safety, the old man, given his inherently honorable nature, wouldn't be able to stand idly by. That was how Josh once again contacted El Tuco and Fabio, the same thugs prowling around the area. He promised them a hefty sum of money if they brought him the boy alive, and soon. His only requirement was that they act discreetly so as not to arouse police suspicion, or at least not too much. Eager for a big payoff, the thugs once more ventured into the tracks along the river and the ramshackle houses, demanding answers from whoever they met, using brutal intimidation. After several days of searching, they picked up a solid lead. A farmer admitted seeing a boy carrying supplies into the woods, sometimes heading out at dusk toward a half-hidden cabin. El Tuco and Fabio hid at a bend in that trail, certain that sooner or later the small boy would pass by again. Indeed, that afternoon, John left the cabin in search of food and some medicine for Mr. Andrew. Eusebio, accompanying him for safety, kept some distance, staying alert to any sign of danger. The ambush was swift and devastating. As John stepped into a muddy patch, El Tuco sprang from the bushes and seized him from behind, pinning his arms. The boy let out a scream of panic that echoed through the trees. Hearing the cry, Eusebio ran to help, but soon came face to face with Fabio, who struck him in the temple with the butt of a pistol. Despite his military background, the ex-soldier couldn't react in time. He collapsed to the ground, barely catching sight of John's terrified face as they forced him into a filthy old vehicle. His vision blurred by pain, Eusebio struggled to get up, but his body wouldn't obey. Desperate, he managed to crawl a few meters, fully aware the boy had been kidnapped. One thought whirled in his mind. They had discovered Mr. Andrew's trail and were using John to force the old man out of hiding. He tasted blood, metallic on his tongue, while a persistent ringing hammered in his head. Meanwhile, El Tuco and Fabio drove at full speed to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. There, Josh was waiting, his face drawn tight with tension. Seeing John dragged out, bound and wearing dirty clothes, he felt a fleeting pang of remorse, only to have it disappear the moment he thought of Baeza and the threats trailing him. He walked up to the boy, a vindictive gleam in his eye, as if clutching the last card he had left. "Where's the old man?" he barked, gripping the boy's arm roughly. John, gripped by terror, said nothing. "Not going to talk?" Josh persisted, grinding his teeth. Recalling his pact with Mr. Andrew, John clamped his lips shut, determined not to give away Eusebio's cabin. Josh glanced knowingly at the thugs, as if telling them to use more persuasive tactics. Yet before giving the order, he opted for a different approach. He used a cell phone to record a brief video of John being held against his will. "If Mr. Andrew is alive, he surely cares about this kid's life," Josh muttered, a note of malice creeping into his tone. "We'll get this message to him one way or another." Aiming the phone at a trembling, frightened John, Josh spoke in a chilling voice. "Mr. Andrew, I know you're still alive. You will sign over the company and everything you own, or this boy will pay the price. You've got 48 hours to show up wherever I say." When the recording finished, the thugs grinned triumphantly. Josh slipped the phone into his pocket and glared at John with contempt. You're worthless to me, understand? You're just my bait." John's heart pounded in his chest, a terrifying mix of fear and a growing sense of indignation. Although he couldn't imagine how, he trusted that Mr. Andrew, Eusebio, and Dr. Johnson would do something to save him. His thoughts leapt to his sick mother, dreading that this tragedy would weigh on her like a sledgehammer. Meanwhile, in that deserted warehouse, Josh clung to the hope that his threat would soon reach the old man's ears. He believed that, if everything went as planned, Mr. Andrew would be forced to abandon his hideout and sign over the paperwork that guaranteed Josh a massive fortune. Little did he know that the boy's stubborn spirit and the loyalty of those protecting the injured magnate were about to put his schemes in check. The clock was ticking, and John's life hung by an ever more fragile thread. Mr. Andrew struggled to breathe in the dim light of the cabin. Though his fever had let up that morning, he was still weighed down by weakness. Even so, there was a new determination glowing in his eyes. He knew his nephew Josh was holding John captive, a child who had saved his life and whom he now felt morally bound to protect. Though he still couldn't walk steadily, he saw no choice. He had to present himself to Josh to save the boy. "But if you go now, it could be fatal," Dr. Johnson cautioned, expertly examining the head wound. "You're not fully recovered yet. If I don't act, John will die. Everything will have been in vain," Mr. Andrew said, his voice raspy. Eusebio, leaning against the wall with a bandage on his temple, broke in. He had arrived shortly before, injured from Fabio's blow during John's abduction. With difficulty, he described to Mr. Andrew and the doctor what had happened, how those men had ambushed the boy and shoved him into a broken-down car. He also explained that, as they fled, one of the thugs had muttered something about the place where they would meet Josh. "I caught part of the location," the ex-soldier said, brow furrowed. "An old warehouse on the outskirts. That's probably where they'll demand you sign the papers." While they spoke, a faint sound at the cabin door announced the unexpected arrival of Detective Prieto. Eusebio had secretly contacted him through an urgent message delivered to the city by a helpful neighbor. Despite Commissioner Smith's opposition, Prieto had wasted no time in coming. He entered cautiously, taking in the modest cabin where he finally confirmed that Mr. Andrew was indeed alive. "I knew it," he murmured, stunned. "I had a hunch you were hidden away, injured." For a moment, Mr. Andrew eyed him warily, aware a police officer could complicate matters. But Eusebio spoke up in the detective's favor, saying he'd seen the man investigate on his own and refused to close the case. Prieto confirmed everyone's fears. Josh had corrupt connections, including Commissioner Smith, and had woven a web of bribes to keep the truth buried. "I understand we need to save the boy," Prieto affirmed. "We'll have to set up a very discreet operation, or Josh will find out and might hurt John." Nodding slowly, Mr. Andrew decided he couldn't remain in hiding any longer, while John's life was on the line because of him. Although the detective suggested that he stay in the cabin and let the police handle it, the old man insisted on coming forward himself. He had to ensure Josh didn't act rashly and harm the boy prematurely. "Gather everyone and escort Mr. Andrew, but don't draw attention," Eusebio said hoarsely. "I'll come along later, once I've readied a couple of deterrent weapons." Prieto quickly devised a plan. He'd drive Mr. Andrew in an old civilian car so it wouldn't look like a police operation. A few trusted officers would station themselves at a strategic point near the warehouse. Dr. Johnson insisted on going too, bringing a medical kit in case John needed immediate care. Hours later, dusk draped the outskirts of the city in a fiery glow as Prieto's vehicle pulled up near the abandoned warehouse. Stepping out, Mr. Andrew felt a wave of dizziness, bracing himself against the car door so he wouldn't collapse. Prieto steadied him gently, reminding him not to do anything reckless. Before stepping away, the detective quietly said, "Trust us. As soon as you confirm the boy is alive, give us the signal." Mr. Andrew advanced unsteadily to the warehouse's half-destroyed entrance. In the back, he heard the low hum of voices. A few weak electric lamps lit the inside, and the air smelled of dampness mixed with old grease. Josh waited in the center of the large space, flanked by El Tuco and Fabio, who guarded a terrified John tied to a chair. The child's eyes lit up upon recognizing the old man, but he still looked tense, afraid this would all end in tragedy. "Finally decided to show yourself," Josh growled, arms folded. "I was starting to think you really were dead, Uncle." Straining to stand as straight as possible, Mr. Andrew glanced sidelong at the boy, confirming that he was alive, albeit with a cut on his lip and his wrists reddened from the rope. "What do you want?" the old man asked in a hoarse voice. "You know damn well," Josh retorted bitterly. "You're going to sign away the company, your assets, everything, right now." He shoved a folder of legal documents at him, detailing the transfer of shares and bank accounts. Noticing Mr. Andrew's hesitation, El Tuco reached toward his belt, hinting at the gun he carried. Fabio, knife in hand, stood behind John, silently threatening him. "Sign, or this kid leaves this world," Josh muttered. The look in his eyes betrayed desperation and fear, far from the confident facade he once tried to maintain around the family. Mr. Andrew swallowed hard. From the darkened warehouse, he thought of his own boyhood and the hand John had extended to him without knowing who he was. He stepped closer, looking down at the documents, then spoke. "First, you let the boy go. I want to see him free before I put my signature on anything." Josh pressed his lips together. He knew that the moment he freed John, the old man might refuse to sign. And yet he also realized that if he kept threatening the kid outright, Mr. Andrew might refuse altogether. He hesitated for a second, just as a dull thump at the back of the warehouse made him glance sideways. El Tuco and Fabio tensed. "This isn't a negotiation," Josh growled, turning back to glare at Mr. Andrew. "Sign now." The old man took the folder, feeling his hands tremble. Aware he couldn't yield, he raised his voice in a tone that startled them all. "I'll tell you again. Release the boy first. You've already robbed me of any reason to trust you. Don't make me question your sanity any further." Within seconds, the atmosphere turned explosive. Fabio pressed his knife to John's throat, while El Tuco scanned the surroundings, bracing for someone to break in. The child let out a terrified whimper. Mr. Andrew closed his eyes briefly, regretting they had sunk so low that his own nephew was behind this. "Leave John alone," he shouted, struggling to contain his anger. "I won't sign unless you let him go." Josh wavered, breath coming in quick pants. He thought of Baeza, of the debts, of the family that blocked all his moves. He felt he had no option. Drawing a pistol himself, he aimed it at Mr. Andrew, prepared to use force if need be. That was when a flash of light cut across the main doorway. Detective Prieto and two officers stepped in, guns raised, shouting, "Police! Drop your weapons and let the boy go!" The place erupted in shouts and chaos. El Tuco and Fabio whipped around, pointing their guns at the officers, while Josh, cornered, backed away with his pistol held high. John, eyes wide, struggled against the ropes. At that moment, Dr. Johnson rushed inside amid the commotion, heading behind John. Moving swiftly, she cut through the ropes that held him. The boy was overwhelmed with relief, nearly collapsing, but the doctor helped him to his feet. Mr. Andrew, shielding his head with one arm, took advantage of the mayhem to move aside. His mind whirled between relief at seeing John freed and the fear that Josh, in desperation, might open fire. Prieto shouted once more for them to drop their weapons, but El Tuco and Fabio weren't about to surrender. The warehouse was a storm of voices, echoes, and threats, a final trap, tension rocketing toward a point of no return. Off to the side, Josh pulled the trigger without thinking, firing at the ceiling as if to scare them all. The gunshot thundered through the warehouse, unleashing a chain of events that would forever change the fate of everyone present. The gunshot rang out inside the warehouse like contained thunder. For an instant, the echo seemed to freeze everyone present. John, barely freed from his bonds, flinched and covered his ears. Dr. Johnson instinctively pulled him close, trying to protect him. Detective Prieto, along with the two officers at his side, raised his voice, issuing a final warning. "Drop your weapons and get down on the ground," he shouted, aiming at El Tuco and Fabio, who refused to back down. Hidden behind a stack of rusted boxes, Mr. Andrew felt a sudden ache in his chest upon seeing his nephew Josh, in a burst of desperation, cock the gun once more. The young man's gaze revealed both fury and despair. Nearby, El Tuco and Fabio were retreating hesitantly, seeking cover behind a few concrete columns, still pointing their guns at the police. In the cramped space offered by the structure, tension escalated to a breaking point. "It didn't have to go this far," Josh roared, as his thugs exchanged gunfire with Prieto's officers. "If only you'd cooperated with me, Uncle." His words rang hollow, laden with rage and frustration. A burst of light from one of the henchmen's pistols lit Josh's face, revealing the cold sweat beading on his brow. The next second, Prieto and his two men answered with bullets that whistled through the air, striking the walls and sending up dust and splinters. With a trembling hand, El Tuco fired a shot that caught one of the officers in the leg, and the man dropped to the floor with a muffled groan. Taking advantage of the chaos, Josh made a swift move toward where Mr. Andrew lay hidden. The old man, still weakened by his injuries, barely had time to rise and look up when he saw his nephew aiming right at him. That cold metal barrel seemed like an inevitable abyss. "You leave me no choice," Josh muttered, eyes brimming with desperation. "You ruined everything." Mr. Andrew swallowed hard, searching for words to appeal to Josh's humanity, but he never managed to speak them. The young man pulled the trigger. The gunshot reverberated once more, and the old man felt a sudden blow to his side, a piercing pain that made him gasp and drop to his knees. It all happened in one harrowing instant. Laura and Rick, who had arrived running in behind the police, let out a cry as they saw Mr. Andrew collapse against the rusted boxes. "Dad!" Laura moaned, sprinting toward him before anyone could hold her back. At the sound of the shot, Prieto spun around and fired a warning round near Josh's position, forcing him to step back. That gave the detective the opening he needed. Amid the swirling smoke, he flung himself at the younger man, tackling him to the ground. The pistol skittered across the dusty floor. In the brief struggle, Josh landed an elbow on the detective, but Prieto had already immobilized his arm. With a deft movement, he pinned him, twisting him over and snapping on handcuffs. "Let go!" Josh shouted, fighting against him. "This isn't over!" Still, his words rang out with far less force than he'd hoped. Gritting his teeth, Prieto simply shoved him firmly against the floor, making sure he couldn't break free. Meanwhile, on the far side of the warehouse, El Tuco and Fabio kept firing at one of the officers until they caught sight of Josh in cuffs. They realized it was all over. One of them let out a frustrated curse and raised his hands in surrender, tossing his weapon to the ground. The other, after a moment's hesitation, did the same. "Stop! We give up!" they cried nervously. The police moved in, handcuffing them. Meanwhile, Dr. Johnson, crouched next to Mr. Andrew, checked the wound on the old man's side. Laura, tears streaking her face, held her father's hand. He was breathing unevenly but conscious. A thin trail of blood stained his shirt, yet at a glance it didn't look like a fatal hit. Skilled and calm, the doctor pressed a clean cloth to stop the bleeding. "It's not serious," she murmured, relieved. "The bullet only grazed him. He just needs stitches and some rest." Mr. Andrew shut his eyes, swallowing the pain. John, trembling, edged closer alongside Rick to check on the old man. Seeing he was still conscious, lifted a huge weight off the boy's chest. But his eyes drifted to Josh, who Prieto was forcing up onto his feet with the cuffs locked in place. The twisted look on the young man's face betrayed the enormity of his failure. As they escorted him outside, Josh lashed out with a torrent of incoherent words, blaming his uncle for excluding him, accusing Laura of uncovering the will, and cursing Prieto for ruining his plan. Yet his voice faded into a murmur of anger and frustration. El Tuco and Fabio, heads bowed, knew their game was up, burdened by the kidnapping of the child and the shootout with the police. Out in front of the warehouse, as reinforcements and ambulances arrived, Prieto made certain that not a single detail was missed in sealing the case against Josh and his accomplices. He sorted through the documents Josh had intended to force Mr. Andrew to sign, clear proof of extortion. He also had call records linking Josh to Martin Baeza and the shady financial dealings he had carried out in the textile company. Laura, still shaken, approached her cousin with a mix of pity and rage. Josh lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. At last, he mumbled something unintelligible. "You had no right. It was mine." "It wasn't yours," she replied in a near whisper. "And it never will be." Rick, still in shock, simply rested a hand on Laura's shoulder, aware that this was the last time they would see Josh outside of prison clothes. The police loaded him into a vehicle along with El Tuco and Fabio, who in vain tried to justify their actions. A few minutes later, Prieto returned to where Mr. Andrew was receiving first aid from Dr. Johnson. The old man looked up with difficulty and mumbled a weak expression of gratitude. The detective offered him a conciliatory smile, assuring him that everything had been worth it. Now, with Josh in custody and the evidence of his financial fraud and corruption fully exposed, a legal process lay ahead in which the young man would face serious charges for attempted homicide, kidnapping, fraud, and more. "I've no doubt justice will take its course," Prieto said, without taking his eyes off Josh as he was led away in handcuffs. "You've rid yourself of a terrible burden, Mr. Andrew." As the ambulance's sirens wailed to take the wounded magnate away, John watched the scene with a sinking heart. He had witnessed a confrontation that brought this cycle of terror to a close. In the blend of childlike innocence and heavy responsibility, he realized that he and Mr. Andrew were now bound by an unbreakable bond of solidarity and gratitude. The old man, powerful though he might be, had lost part of his family to betrayal, but in doing so, he had gained a chance to settle old scores with life. Inside the ambulance, Mr. Andrew took a deep breath and closed his eyes, certain that despite the gunshot and the pain in his side, things were at last heading toward a more just resolution. Beneath the overcast sky of the city outskirts, Josh's downfall symbolized the end of a realm of intrigue and greed that until then had threatened to rob many people of their hope. Now, the future lay in the hands of truth, justice, and the solidarity of those who had risked everything to do what was right. Josh's trial drew the media's attention throughout the region. News that a nephew had tried to kill his millionaire uncle to take over the company aroused a mixture of scandal and shock. With the evidence presented by Detective Prieto, including footage of John's kidnapping and documents proving fraudulent transfers, the judge had no hesitation in ordering preventive detention for Josh. During the process, the name of Martin Baeza also came to light, a shady investor who had financed Josh's illegal dealings and who practiced usury. Once authorities located and arrested Baeza, the corrupt network strangling Josh definitively collapsed. Like dominoes, the consequences rippled outward. Commissioner Smith, who had taken bribes to impede the investigation, had no choice but to resign in the face of a public scandal. It emerged how he had dismissed reports and key information about Mr. Andrew's disappearance, thereby aiding Josh and his accomplices. His exemplary punishment sent a clear message that corruption would come at a high price. Meanwhile, Prieto was formally commended for his bravery and integrity after persisting in his investigation despite official opposition. He received a commendation and the chance for promotion in the police force. Meanwhile, Mr. Andrew was recovering in the city hospital after the gunshot wound he suffered at the warehouse. Though the shot hadn't been fatal, it required minor surgery and several days of rest. During that time, Laura and Rick took turns staying by his side. There were tears and overdue conversations, especially between Laura and her father, as she realized that for many years she had misunderstood Mr. Andrew's distant demeanor without suspecting the scale of his social projects. Rick, for his part, pledged to overcome his usual passivity and work with his brother to mend the family's fractures. John, shy as ever, visited Mr. Andrew as soon as Dr. Johnson allowed it. Rosa, the boy's mother, only just recovered from her fevers, arrived leaning on a cane, overwhelmed with gratitude toward the old man who had saved her son's life. But in Mr. Andrew's view, he was the one in debt. Never would he forget that, without John's intervention, he would have drowned under that bridge. And so, as soon as he was discharged from the hospital, he honored the pact he and the boy had forged. 1. Paying Rosa's debt. With a check signed by the family's lawyer, Mr. Andrew took care of everything owed to Nicholas, the loan shark. That very afternoon, Rosa breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that no thug would come threatening to evict her ever again. 2. Medication and treatment. Through Dr. Johnson, Mr. Andrew covered all the medical costs needed for Rosa's recovery. He made sure she received the proper care and medicine to overcome her recurring bouts of fever. 3. A scholarship for John. Under an urgent program, Mr. Andrew offered the boy a chance to study at a well-regarded school, all expenses paid. He also included support so that Luli, John's little sister, could receive a proper education. The old man's next step was to relaunch the major social project that had long been brewing in secret. Laura and Rick joined him enthusiastically, mindful of the initiative's importance. It not only involved building schools and libraries in poor neighborhoods, but also advocated for teacher training, scholarship programs, and healthcare centers. They retrieved the documents Laura had found in the family library and expanded them into an even more ambitious plan. To coordinate security for the new buildings and manage logistics in remote areas, Mr. Andrew invited Eusebio to join the team. The ex-soldier, initially hesitant, recognized it as a chance for both redemption and genuine service to the community. Drawing on his experience, he oversaw construction in difficult-to-reach regions and ensured the facilities were built to decent standards. As for Dr. Johnson, she contributed her expertise in preventive health programs, vaccination drives, and affordable medical consultations. One sunny afternoon, several weeks after the dust had settled, Laura accompanied her father to preside over a symbolic ceremony, the official launch of the educational project, Seeds of the Future. It took place in a university auditorium before government officials, journalists, and members of civic organizations. In his opening address, Rick spoke with a clear, steady voice, highlighting how the family had suffered a painful rift, but that out of that tragedy had come the resolve to honor those who fought for the most vulnerable. The most emotional moment came at the close of the event, when Mr. Andrew, leaning on his cane and still bandaged around his side, embraced John. Visibly moved, the boy accepted a package tied with a blue ribbon, his first textbooks, along with a new notebook. Amid gentle applause, Mr. Andrew whispered, "Never stop learning, my boy. You saved my life, and I want to help you reach every one of your dreams." John nodded, eyes shining, well aware that the scholarship gave him his first real chance at a different future. As he stepped away from the stage, clutching his new books, he thought of Rosa and Luli, who would no longer have to live with the fear of losing their home. And he remembered the nights spent fishing in secret for spare coins, never imagining that one brave act would lead him to change his own story. So it was that, with Josh and Baeza behind bars, Commissioner Smith dismissed, and Detective Prieto hailed as a local hero, Mr. Andrew's family left behind a dark chapter. Now, the textile empire transformed into a beacon of hope for underserved communities. The old man, fully aware of his physical frailty, smiled at the sight of each donation, each school built, all serving to break the cycle of poverty in which so many children were growing up without opportunities. That redemption, built on the foundation of solidarity, marked the dawn of a new era for everyone. And in John's eyes, as he sat at a school desk with books laid out before him, there shone the promise of a bright future. The story of Mr. Andrew, John, and all the characters woven into this account reminds us that beneath appearances and social differences, essential human values can unite people from vastly different worlds. A humble child and a wealthy magnate discovered that true well-being doesn't stem from money or show, but from solidarity and empathy. Sometimes, a single act of generosity can save not only our own life, but also our soul. John, expecting nothing in return, risked his safety to rescue Mr. Andrew. In turn, the old man, despite his wealth, found new meaning in his fortune by restoring hope to those who needed it most. The ex-soldier Eusebio, for his part, found redemption by serving a noble cause that washed away his past regrets. This story also shows us that limitless ambition, embodied by Josh, can blind us and drive us to unthinkable extremes. The desire to seize power quickly, no matter the cost, ultimately destroyed the reputation and future of the one who sought it. In contrast, loyalty, family bonds, and justice prevailed over corruption and violence. Ultimately, the great lesson here is that when we protect and fight for the lives of others, we are also safeguarding our own humanity. A simple act of kindness can change the destiny of those who least expect it, and redemption often arrives through sincere acts of courage and compassion. In this way, hardship and treachery can pave the way for new beginnings marked by solidarity and forgiveness. And that's where our journey ends, friends. Thank you so much for joining us all the way to the end of this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more exciting content. See you soon.